Well, hi everyone. Good to be with you today. I'm eager to talk to you about building your staff with volunteer leaders. My name is Derek Sanford. I'm from Erie, Pennsylvania. I have a wife, Kim, who I've been married to for 30 years, and we have three grown kids. You can see them here in this picture, Caleb, Chase, and Aiden. I've also been at Grace Church as a pastor here for the last 26 years. And it's been an incredible ride. I've had an incredible experience here. I started as the youth pastor, and a lot of this talk is built around the idea of lived experience. And we actually have a lot of the students who are on my youth ministry who are part of our staff now. They started out as incredible volunteer leaders, and so we have a rich history of that. And I just want to say as I start this talk, this is not a magic bullet, but I do believe that there's kind of an anti-celebrity model in doing this. I think we've all, been seeing across our nation this idea that you kind of grow a church, you got to have a celebrity pastor, and to do that, and that has not been our approach, and our church has still grown and been very successful in reaching people with the gospel in our area. And so I really think this subject matter is a step in the direction of Jesus' leadership style, and is based on the idea of raising others up and really upending the power balance that exists in some of the way that we do church in America these days. But I want to start with a story, and it's a story about a partnership that we have in Japan. And there's a pastor there that we partner with named Nobu, and one of it's actually his father, who was the planter of the church that he now serves at. His father, who's retired, is still kind of in an emeritus role in that church. But his father had come to the United States when we were first starting our partnership, and we'll call him Pastor K. Okay, that's the dad's name. And he visited our church, and he was here for a few weeks, and he was involved in all kinds of areas of our ministry so that he could see firsthand how we operated. And he went home, and I'd found out that Pastor K, when he went back to Japan, had prepared 2 weeks of training material to take their church through about our church and his impressions of our church. And so, as you can imagine, I was very curious as to what his impressions were. And so when I talked to Nobu on the phone the next time, we had this conversation, and I basically asked him, like, what did Pastor K think of our church? And it's the equivalent of asking maybe a girl on a second date or whatever when you say, will you come on a date with me? Or when you finally say, do you love me? You're kind of putting yourself out there. And so I put myself out there and said, what did Pastor K think of our church? And Nobu responded with this, and I think some things got lost in translation, but he said something along the lines of, like, when we hear about a mega church in America, we think that there has to be a famous leader, or that the pastor has a charismatic personality, or that the pastor is a brilliant communicator, and you can feel it coming. He said, in your church, we found none of these things. And I was a little offended at first, but I got over it quickly, because he went on to describe the church that I know and love, and the church that's known not mainly for the quality of our preaching, not even mainly for the quality of our worship services or our kids' ministry, but the quality and capacity of our people, of our volunteers. And it turned out to be probably the greatest compliment I've ever received. So for a lot of churches both big and small, it seems like the answer to every one of their problems is to hire more staff. So for big churches, they just need to keep the machine going and to make sure that everything is staffed and flowing. But those churches are one economic downturn away from real trouble in the church. And for small churches, it becomes such a paralyzing thing when the pastor is doing everything, him or herself, and they just get it in their mind saying the church is not going to take the next step of growth until we make that next hire, until we finally have enough money to hire a youth pastor, to hire a worship pastor. Well, in 2011, we had a major turning point, an aha moment here at Grace. We were a medium-sized church at the time. We were facing that moment where we had more ministry than I could accomplish and that our paid staff could accomplish, and I was kind of dying under the pressure of it all. And we had this staff retreat, and at our staff retreat, I went up and stood at the whiteboard, and we were doing a SWOT analysis, which we do often, and we took the S and the O, strengths and opportunities, and obviously weaknesses and threats. And we got the whole board full of words. And there was still this kind of sinking feeling, like I'm not sure we've fully got everything on this board. And one of our insightful staff members at the time said, where would our people fit on this little chart? Like, where would you put our people? And it was an aha moment for me that when I realized, and I put it right under the strengths. In fact, I squeezed it right in there under the S is probably our top strength. And it was the realization that more than our budget, more than our buildings, more than a cool new approach to worship, that our people are our greatest asset. I believe it's probably true of your church or organization too. And I'm just convinced of this kind of basic idea that God knows how to make churches. You know, the body concept is Paul's leading metaphor for the church in the New Testament. He doesn't talk about the institution of the church. He doesn't talk about the organization of the church. He talks about the body, which means that all parts need to be there working together. The body isn't designed for one part, the pastor, to run around and do everything for the body. It's built so that all parts are doing their job. And the reality is there are people in your church. Found out there were people in my church who have knowledge that I don't have, who have skills that I don't have, who have gifts that I don't have, who have influence that I don't have. And I realized very quickly as we began promoting these people into positions of leadership, I don't have enough experience to know what to do about most social justice issues in our community. I don't have the skill, to start the new digital initiative. I have no clue how to counsel a person through anxiety or how to create and execute a financial plan. But I do know that there are people in my church who are experts at all of those things. And most of those people have never imagined that their skills could be used for the kingdom. They think that their best and highest use of those skills is through their secular job. And so these realizations started setting in, and I want to throw out a word for you that's kind of the key word for this whole talk. I actually wrote a book about this as well, but the word is untapped. And I believe and have come to believe that the greatest untapped resource in most churches are high-capacity volunteer leaders. That there are people sitting in the seats of big churches and small churches, urban churches and suburban churches, rural and churches and black and white churches and international churches, and they attend our churches and they sing and they take notes and they might even be in a small group and they may even serve in a ministry, and yet they have the potential to impact God's kingdom in a powerful and profound way. And they've been largely untapped. This word untapped simply means available but not used. And so I wonder how many people in our churches are available to do great things for God, but we haven't created an environment where they could be used. We haven't asked the question. We haven't asked them to step up. So I want to make a distinction. All churches, many organizations have tons of volunteers who do very important work. So most churches have greeters and ushers and nursery workers and small group leaders and food pantry workers and musicians. But most of those ministries overall are led by paid staff. And the thing that we started wondering is what if the supervisors at every level of our church were also volunteers? So basically making volunteers into staff people. And we began at the time what we've come to call now our volunteer leadership culture. It's a culture in which high-capacity volunteers, not just paid staff, high-capacity volunteers are entrusted with the responsibility of leading leaders. And we started taking that idea to its logical conclusion. So to the point where we've had volunteers supervising paid staff if that's their gift. So we had a scenario where we have a volunteer who's supervising our paid pastoral staff, determining their vacation requests and their salary ranges and all the stuff. So in 2011, we just started recruiting high-capacity leaders from our congregation to join our staff without pay, gave them responsibility that matched their capacity, and our church began to take off. We began to walk in a whole new identity. Again, I mentioned I've written a book about this. The book is called Untapped Church. I would love for you, if you're willing, this is not a commercial, but I would love for you to go over to DerekSanford.com. There's a bunch of free resources there. You can also find the book there. Also there, you can find the slide deck for this talk that I'm using right now, and you can get it there for free as well. But let me give you a little snapshot of Grace Church so that you know where I'm coming from. So Grace was an old church. We like to say we're an old church that we don't act our age. Grace started in 1895 as the Swedish Baptist Church in downtown Erie, and Erie, Pennsylvania is where we're located. Erie is a county of about 100,000 people. We're in the Rust Belt here in Pennsylvania. It's mostly a Catholic town. Pre-COVID, we were a church of about 2,100 people or so spread across 3 sites. And our staff is made up of about 35 paid staff and about 60 volunteer staff. And I just want to introduce you to a couple of them here just so you can get a little snapshot of some of these leaders. Sarah, stay-at-home mom. She works probably 20 to 25 hours a week in content and preaching. You're going to meet her in a minute. Jim is one of our pastors. He's also a partner at a local accounting firm. He's a volunteer leader, works some 15 to 20 hours a week in our staff care. And he's also a site pastor at one of our locations. And then Doris is a retired executive. She works about probably 15 hours a week or so, and she does leadership coaching. And so these are just a snapshot of the dozens and dozens of people that serve in these high-capacity leadership roles. So I want to have a couple movements here to this talk. I want to talk a little bit about some biblical foundations for staffing, and then we'll move into some more practical ideas about how we establish this culture. But let me start with some foundational ideas about staffing. So the first thing I would say is to strive for a plurality of leaders. So there aren't a ton of prescriptive commands in the New Testament about church government. There are a lot of descriptive ideas as Paul was starting new churches. And one of the things that we see fairly consistently is that there's always a plurality of leaders. So there are elders or deacons or deaconesses. And even when there seems to be a point leader like Timothy or whatever, there's always these other leaders, a plurality of leaders. Which reminds me that really God's pattern is that nobody should be doing ministry alone. It should always be done in a plurality. It should always be done in a team. Jesus could have saved the world alone, and yet he chose a team of 12 that he was going to change the world through. I think about the Trinity. God himself is in community as a ministry team, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. I just mentioned the body, this idea that it's many parts working together. And I know there's pastors who have kind of gotten in the mode of thinking like, I need to do this all myself. I need to do all the preaching. I need to do all the counseling, all the music, the finances, the bulletin, the soundboard. I need to run the meetings. And your church will willingly come along. They'll come along and say, no, that's what we pay you for. That is not true. It is not biblical. In fact, it's anti-biblical because the Bible promotes a plurality of leadership. Think about Jesus, the way he led and the way he chose his disciples. I mean, he selected those disciples in a polarized Jewish society. Like you think our society is polarized right now. Jesus' world was just as polarized. There were the Pharisees. They were kind of the religious fundamentalists of the day, deeply conservative. There were the Essenes. They were kind of the Amish. They were separatists, unengaged, uninvolved. There were the Sadducees, who were probably more like the progressive mainline Christians, a little bit leaning liberal politically. There were the Zealots. These were kind of the Occupy Wall Street people, the Black Lives Matter. They believed in protesting and being confrontational to government corruption. There were the Sicarii. They were the violent branch, kind of the Antifa or abortion clinic bomber, variety of the time. Again, these are not perfect analogies, but I want us to have a framework in our minds of the kinds of people that Jesus chose to be on his team. His disciples were from many of these factions, people who were sympathetic to the Essenes and the Sadducees and the Zealots. And so Jesus grabbed some protesters and he grabbed some conservative Christians and a couple Amish kids and IRS workers. And he said, now love each other and the world will know you're my disciples. And you're darn right, they will, because it was a radical thing. But Jesus wanted to show through this diverse ministry team that something bigger was going on. And so we have this idea of just this plurality of leadership and that plurality should be diverse in its makeup. The second thing I would say in terms of foundation is just to decentralize control. Decentralized control. It's easy to see in the Old Testament how Moses hung on to leadership. He was the one. He was the anointed one. He was the one who stood at the burning bush and got that call. He was the one whose staff turned into a snake. And he's the one who issued his Emancipation Proclamation and parted the Red Sea and took water from the rock and had manna from heaven. Like he was the one with the direct line to God and all decisions flowed through him. And yet we come to this moment where Moses receives a rebuke. Exodus 18:17. Moses' father-in-law said to him, what you're doing is not good. You and the people, you will certainly wear yourselves out, for the thing is too heavy for you. You're not able to do it alone. That's a good word for some of you. You are not able to do it alone. And the answer was to decentralize. And so he divided the people into thousands and hundreds and fifties and tens, and he put decision makers over each of those factions. And there's a lot of leaders, a lot of pastors, frankly, who are control freaks. We have well-intentioned, motivations, but there's some Messiah complex there, and it's important that we understand that really the church is a decentralized movement. It's also a non-clerical movement. So like if you look at the first century Christian church, it was a people's movement. And like the distinguishing mark of the church is that there was no, clerical hierarchy. It was the fact that God's Spirit was dwelling with ordinary common people, and that through them, the Spirit manifested Jesus' life to this believing community and to the whole world. There was no special clerical class that was distinct from the people of God that appears in the New Testament. Paul never ordains a cleric, for example, to perform the church's ministry. When he establishes a church, he leaves a council of elders chosen from among the believers to jointly oversee the church. Another foundation is just really to unleash the priesthood. So in the Old Testament, the religious life of Israel was built around this two-track system. There were the priests and there were everyone else. And if you were a priest, there were special places that you could go. There were prayers that only you could pray. There were clothes that only you could wear. And then when Jesus came into the scene, he didn't do away with the priesthood. He gave it away to everyone. So in 1 Peter 2:9, Peter says, "But you are a chosen people, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, God's special possession, that you may declare the praises of him who called you out of the darkness and into his wonderful light." And so Jesus gave the priesthood to everyone. The priesthood of all believers is the word. But throughout history, the church has drifted back into this two-track system. People in our churches have been conditioned to say, well, that's the pastor's job, or that's the staff's job. It's the pastor's job to study the Bible and then to tell us about it. It's the pastor's job to visit the sick. It's the pastor's job to counsel the broken, to serve the poor, to evangelize the lost. And that model will end in disappointment every time, because everyone is a priest. And the whole concept of the Bible is built around this priesthood of all believers. Here's the last biblical foundation. It's to equip the saints. Ephesians 4:11 says, "And he gave the apostles, and he gave the prophets, and the evangelists, and the shepherds, and teachers. He gave the leaders of the church to equip the saints for the work of ministry, for the building up of the body of Christ." So the job of leaders in the church is to equip the saints. It's not to do all the ministry. I've talked to a bunch of pastors who say, listen, I just feel guilty asking volunteers to do something that's kind of my job to do. And I would just come back and say, if you're in ministry, if you get a chance to preach, for example, on a regular basis like I do, you probably know that feeling after a sermon where you walk home and you go, man, I just feel that feeling like I've connected with people, that there's been this life-changing ministry moment. And you sit back in your chair in exhaustion going, I can't believe that God used me like that. I can't believe that I get to be used in the hand of God. And what I would say to you is, if you're trying to do all the ministry yourself, you're actually robbing people from that experience. There are people who stand at a drill press all day, real estate agents and insurance brokers and car dealers and bankers and bricklayers and police officers and teachers and plumbers, some of whom have little thrill left in their job. But if you open the door for them, they can actually get to know the feeling of being used in the hand of God for great things. And so we can't apologize. We can't hold back from inviting people into significant ministry in the church. So, like, if you do it all yourself, you will rob them of that eternal privilege, and you'll stunt the growth of your church. So I remind you today that your job is to equip the saints for works of ministry. So let's talk specifics now. How to build your staff with volunteer leaders. And I'll just tell you from my perspective, it's hard. We've been doing this for a while now, but it's hard when we've been living out something and working it out, and to go back and to try to systematize it and to write a book about it and all that kind of stuff. So please don't confuse these things for like 3 easy steps and you can do this. In the book, I lay out 5 different steps that we kind of came through. They're really stages that we came through in establishing this culture. So I'm going to kind of concentrate on the first couple of those and then leave the rest. But I want to get very practical. So let me talk first about some preliminary practices that will lay the foundation for this culture to be established in your church. So the first practice is to define your cornerstone calling. It was a key moment for us to really think through, what is the stuff that only I can do? What are the core roles that God specifically called you to? And you won't always have people to do the other stuff, but it kind of gives you a baseline of what you want to start looking for in these high-capacity volunteer leaders. So Acts 6, I think, is such an interesting example of this in the Bible. You know, the apostles reached that moment that I think is far too familiar with people in ministry, where they realize we don't have enough time to do all this ministry. And so they start receiving complaints from the Greek-speaking widows that there's favoritism in the food pantry ministry. And so what do we do? What do we do? Do we burn the midnight oil? Do we wring our hands and complain at conferences? You know, and what they did is they identified their cornerstone calling. They gave everything else away to high-capacity volunteer leaders. They said, our calling is this. We have been called to the Word of God and to prayer, and we're going to give everything else away. And it's actually more stunning than that. There's a stunning declaration in Acts 6:2. They actually said these words. They said, it is not right that we should give up preaching the Word of God to serve tables. Therefore, pick out from among you 7 men of good repute, full of the Spirit and wisdom, whom we will appoint to this duty. But we will devote ourselves to prayer, to the ministry of the Word. Notice what they said. They didn't say it's not convenient for us to do that. They didn't say it's not efficient. They said it is not right for us to serve lunch to the widows. How unspiritual that they would ignore those poor widows like that. I would encourage you to try this in your church if you want to do a little experiment. That they said, we're going to choose people filled with the Spirit, full of faith. Judging by the names, they chose Greek people so they could be able to reach those people that the apostles weren't able to reach. They needed to be empowered and authorized to do so, and the apostles did it. It says in verse 6 that they prayed and laid their hands on them. And really what happened is that in order for the Christian movement to reach its full potential, the apostles needed to stay crystal clear on their cornerstone calling. And instead of ignoring all the ministry opportunities that they couldn't do, and instead of waiting to hire more staff, they decided to solve it with high-capacity volunteers. And the result we see in Acts 6:7, and the word of God continued to increase, and their number of the disciples multiplied greatly in Jerusalem. So, I would really urge you to identify your cornerstone calling. What is the preaching of the word and prayer for you? And then begin to try to give the other stuff away. The second thing that I would encourage you is to simplify your programming. There was a book that came out some years ago called Simple Church that I got angry at the title immediately in my reaction, because I said, the church is not simple. I've come around to the idea, but basically the idea is to remove complexity from your church, and it frees up, one of the things, it removes confusion for your people, but it also frees up your best leaders for your most critical roles. There's a great movie I think it's on Netflix that you can probably watch. It's called The Founder. It's about McDonald's and this guy named Ray Kroc who took McDonald's from kind of a humble diner to global dominance. And in the early days, the original founders of McDonald's, Mac and Dick McDonald, they learned a lesson about simplifying their menu around their best-selling products. They were constantly, as they expanded, they were constantly fighting this menu war, that the menu was becoming too diversified. And so wherever a McDonald's would pop up around the country, they would think they would create their own menu. McDonald's even had this problem even more recently to the modern times. And so some of you may remember the attempts at the McPizza or the McLobster or the McHotdog or the McSpaghetti. These were all menu items at one time. And I came across a menu from 1943 that listed different menu items like barbecued beef at McDonald's, or peanut butter and jelly, and ham and baked beans, and tamales and chili. But what happened, and what was the key to McDonald's success, and Mac's original analysis, is that he realized early on that 87% of total sales for McDonald's came from 3 items: burgers, fries, and drinks. When they realized that, and then they looked around and saw what huge amounts of stock and space and energy were being wasted on other stuff, they began to eliminate menu items ruthlessly to get back down to those 3. And here's what I would say to church leaders. Like when you have the women's ministry, the men's ministry, and Sunday school, and groups, and family nights, and Celebrate Recovery, and the knitting group, and the Bible studies, and the softball team, what's happening is your ministry is becoming diluted. And as a church, I'll just say we're terrible at stopping things. Like we're good at starting things. We're terrible at stopping things. And so I would encourage you to really get crystal clear and to begin to simplify your programming to those most important things that are leveraging the greatest results. Here's the next foundational thing that we kind of laid down, and that is to open the door for volunteer empowerment through preaching and teaching. And so I've got a little list here. You can screenshot this if you want or pause it or whatever, but and I would grab the slide deck at the end. But we began to preach and teach about spiritual gifts, about servant leadership, about living out your calling, about the true nature of the church. So like 1 Corinthians 12 through 14, every believer's a minister, and Esther 4, for such a time as this, and Mark 5, your story matters. And so we preached a couple times a year through these messages. We also had ministry fairs and backstage passes where people could see some of the different ministries we were doing, and shadowing Sundays. We tell inspirational stories of people who are doing it. But all of this was to kind of lay the foundation in preaching and teaching for this new culture. The last thing I would say in this section is just to pray for God to send them to you. So if you look when Jesus chose those original disciples, that crazy array of people that I talked about earlier, like in Luke 6, we get a little hint at how he did that. It says, one of those days Jesus went out to the mountains to pray, and he spent the night praying to God. And when morning came, he called his disciples to him and chose 12 of them, whom he also designated apostles. He prayed all night before he chose his 12. And so if Jesus had to pray, we should definitely spend time praying for these high-capacity leaders to show themselves. Now, before I get into some practical changes that we implemented, I want you to meet one of our amazing leaders, Sarah Burt. I am here with one of our fantastic volunteers, Sarah Burt. Sarah, thanks for being here.
Yeah.
So tell the folks a little bit about your current role, like what are some of your specific responsibilities, how many hours per week you work, like that kind of stuff. Just give us a snapshot of what you do.
Yeah, so currently I am a pastor on staff. I'm part of the preaching team, and I'm probably working about 18 to 24 hours a week, depending on how much I've got to do. But as part of the preaching team, obviously I'm preaching sometimes. But more than that, you've invited me to help with like research and preparation of that kind of content. And then through all of the sermon series, I lead a team that does a lot of writing. So we write read plans for all of our sermon series, daily read plans, life group materials that support those read plans and sermons for life group leaders to use and take. So a lot of writing, a lot of research.
Contributing to YouVersion most
Yes,
recently, which is kind
yes,
of cool.
we are, yeah.
So you can find our plans on YouVersion.
Yes.
Sarah's responsible. All right. So the question everybody's wanting to ask, probably at this session as I've been talking this through, why do you do this without pay? You could be paid very well for whatever you want to do. Why were you compelled to take on this huge responsibility and not get any money for it? And I think we've tried to pay you before, and you haven't let us.
Yeah, you have. Yeah. It comes up maybe annually.
Right.
Like, are you sure you're still okay?
So why? What's the answer to the why?
Well, first of all, just my husband and I feel strongly that this is a way that we give. I feel called to this. I feel led into ministry, and it's been like a slow growth in that. I mean, it started with leading a life group, and then I was doing a couple hours a week of things. And so it's just been a slow build, and through the whole thing, Nate and I just keep coming back to, nope, this is what God has called me to. This is what he's gifted me for, and we just feel like it's the way that we are called to serve the body of Christ. So.
And we appreciate it so much, are benefiting from your gifts. So normally people in real jobs are motivated by money and bonuses and vacation packages and raises and all that kind of stuff. So I wanted to ask you, and again, for other leaders, like what is it about our culture or anything that we do here that keeps you motivated? Like what are some of the things that we've done that make you feel valued, that kind of gives you that buzz of going like, I'm appreciated, like I'm in this?
Yeah. Well, some of it is literally just saying thank you. Some of it is just like getting that card on my birthday or our anniversary or just the checking in, the personal side of those kinds of things. Other things are the simple fact of like, I have to fill out a vacation request.
Right. When you're going to be gone.
Yes, to let you know when I'm going to be gone. But it makes sense because I do have a lot of responsibility in work, and we need to know when I'm away and when I'm not away. So there's a range of things from the very simple that anyone could do, the very practical, to the like, oh no, I'm a legit staff member. You give away responsibility, you delegate authority even so well. So for example, recently, like you handed leading an entire meeting over to me because of like the research side of things that I was doing. And I was a little shocked about that at first. I was like, can I? And I was like, well, if he says I can, I guess I can step into that. And it's something only you have led for the last however many years.
Yeah.
But you and other staff members just don't hesitate to, when it's proper and right for someone to step into a responsibility or a new area of authority, you have no qualms about handing that off.
Yeah.
So that's very affirming.
That's cool.
Yeah.
That's cool. Good to know. Good to hear. So if you were to give a piece of advice to the people watching this, so there may be pastors watching, there may be nonprofit leaders watching who are not sure that somebody would say yes. Like if they went and said, I want you to do this role, I'm not going to pay you any money. What would you tell them if they're questioning, like, I don't know if people would do that?
Yeah. Well, first I want to say that I'm the kind of person that would have never asked. I would have never put myself forward for leadership in the church in any
you
way.
weren't waving your arms
Oh,
around.
no.
Choose me.
That's a personality thing, right?
Right.
I'm just too timid for that. And so if you had never asked, if the people before you had never asked, I wouldn't be here today. So there's that side of it. There are literally people out there who are gifted and who feel called and maybe all stirred up and there's something burning in there. And if you just ask, they'd be like, oh my gosh, I cannot believe that there's a space for me. I think a lot of people are surprised by the fact that I'm a volunteer because they're shocked that a volunteer can do what I'm doing. And so, yeah, that's definitely my story. And the other side of it too is I think even as a volunteer, I can get bogged down in the, man, I've got all these tasks to do. 3 of them I love, 2 of them I don't.
Yeah.
And it's like, oh, wait, I could give these away to somebody who's gifted and called and passionate about these things.
Yeah.
And would love to step into that.
Yeah. Part of what puts you in that role is that you have volunteer teams that you're leading.
Yeah.
So there's our time. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
You're a rock star. Really appreciate you.
Happy to be here.
Thanks.
Thanks.
All right, so let's get super practical. Thanks to Sarah. She's incredible and just a real game changer here. But let me get practical about some of the things that we put in place to establish this culture at Grace. So step 1, we lay the foundation. And one of the things that we did was to diagnose your best growth engines. And so we began to ask the question, what are the ministries that aren't thriving right now, that if they were thriving, they would give us some juice? Like what ministry, if it was well led, would have the best shot at moving the dial for our whole church? What would it be for your church? Like when we were going through this, we came up with 4 areas. Guest follow-up we knew was a big weakness. We didn't have anybody leading that. We didn't have anybody leading our small groups ministry. There was a community outreach ministry called Serve Erie that we thought could really, gain some traction, but we didn't have leadership for it. And we had a venue worship service that didn't have a leader. So we identified those growth engines. And I would just encourage you to do this exercise. Like if you were starting over, what are some of the ministries that would be critical to you in starting the church? What are those growth engines for you? Another way to think about this, instead of growth engines, is to think about systems. So what are some key church systems? So things like new believers and guests and baptism systems and giving and discipleship and counseling and care and volunteering and membership and inviting people into leadership. Like what if you had somebody overseeing one or more of those systems that would begin to move people into the leadership pipeline? So that was the first list. We began to list out what are our biggest needs. Here's a second list. It's to brainstorm your high capacity volunteers. Like I would say this, there are probably people who are already busy. They're not the people that are just sitting around twiddling their thumbs. They're probably already busy with stuff. And you'll want to say no for them. You'll want to say, no, they're too busy for this. Maybe they're in another ministry already. But man, those are your high capacity people. One of the things that we said is, who are the people that are bearing fruit? Like, where is their fruit? Where are there people that other people are following? Where are the bright spots, right? Acts 6, we just came through. What are the people with a good reputation who are full of the Spirit and wise? We found that there were some common threads in these high capacity volunteer leaders. They were business owners, some retired people, some teachers and coaches, some stay-at-home parents, those that have a job that allows them to control their own schedule. Like those are the kinds of people that we have found. And we came up with 5 of those leaders at the time when we were just saying, who are our high capacity leaders? There's Jim, who was a partner at a local firm, Kristen, who was an insurance agent at the time, Doris, a recently retired executive, Michelle, who coordinated educational training, and then Bob, who was a GM at a local restaurant. Now, the last thing is pretty basic. It's to match your growth engines with your best leaders. Again, it's not rocket science. But when you have these two lists, you just kind of match them up. And this is where we started out. And now that we have a bit of a pipeline, it looks more organic than this. But there are times when we still come back to the two lists where we say, what are our growth engines, or what systems, if they were really humming, would help move the dial for us? And then who are our people who are untapped? All right, so that's the first step, is to lay the foundation. The second step is to master the art of the ask. This is when you're recruiting these high-capacity volunteers, leaders. It's a specific skill. So here's the first thing I would say, is to make the ask a big deal. Like with these people, have a personal sit down with them. I've invited people to my house or take them out to a fancy dinner. Like, high-capacity leaders respond to a personal invitation. This is not a general thing from the stage. This is not an email or text. This is not a, hey, catch me after service in my office or whatever. This is a place where you look that person in the eye and you say, you would be perfect for this role. Now, there are a few recruitment traps that I would warn you about that we've learned about along the way. The first I already mentioned, it's saying no for them. Like the temptation is to come up with all the reasons why that person's going to say no. And then you go, well, I probably shouldn't ask them because they're going to say no anyway. Don't say no for them. Take the plunge, go ask them anyway. The second recruitment trap is the soft sell. We have this tendency to come to people and go, listen, this is not going to take you much time at all. It's not going to be hard at all for you. You can squeeze it in your spare time. That is not what high-capacity leaders respond to. They respond to a big challenge. They want to hear, listen, nobody can do this but you. This is going to take sweat and blood and tears, but we need you. So don't soft sell. Another trap is the guilt trap. We're experts at guilt in the church. And so, when you stand up front and you're trying to find people for the kids ministry and you're saying, listen, church, how dare you? Do you want those kids to end up pregnant and on drugs? When you get back and volunteer in the kids ministry, or, we need volunteers for the elderly visits. Like, they went to war for you, you entitled jerk, so don't guilt trip people. Okay. Here's another trap. It's the victim trap. We've learned this from experience. Don't go to these high-capacity volunteers and say, I'm so burned out. I'm just trying to keep my head above water here. Here's what that communicates, that this church is a sinking ship, and I don't want to be a leader on it. The final one is cattle call. You don't recruit high-capacity volunteers with a cattle call from the front on a Sunday morning, because what that communicates is that anyone with a pulse can do this job. Again, make it special. I've encouraged our staff, when you have a high-capacity volunteer that you're trying to bring in, think of it like you're bringing in somebody from out of town. Take them out to a fancy restaurant. Make the ask a big deal. The second thing I would say is to provide a simple job description. This is an important part of the art of the ask. Again, I say simple, not too much, but not too little detail. How we basically format these is we say, here's my role in one sentence. We try to boil the job down to a one-sentence statement. Then we give 2 or 3 bullet points of the general responsibilities of that role. Then we talk about who I report to and who reports to me, and then we put the number of hours per week that we expect that role is going to take. The next thing is to be honest. When you sit down with the person and you make the ask, when you're presenting that simple job description, I would just encourage you to be honest. When you're estimating the number of hours it's going to take that person, be honest. When you're describing the current staff culture, be honest. When you're describing your own strengths and weaknesses as a leader, be honest. Any fuzziness in the expectations up front, we have found, leads to dysfunction later. And so it's better to be honest up front. Here's the final section that I'll talk about in detail today, and that is just to set yourself up for success and to set those volunteers up for success. So here were some practical ways that we did that. The first way is we transitioned to a volunteer-friendly schedule. So it used to be that our staff meetings, which were very paid staff friendly, were Tuesday afternoons at 1 o'clock. We moved that staff meeting from Tuesdays at 1 to Tuesdays at 5:30 to 7:30 so that our volunteer staff could work at their job and get to the staff meeting by then. Another thing that we've done is to really treat those folks like staff. We wanted to to treat them like staff in every way. We want to remove the language that says, this is just a volunteer. We want to treat them like staff. One of the ways we tried to blur and remove all the lines between paid and unpaid staff. We elevated them to that staff level. So we would give them business cards. We would give them the name tags that the rest of our staff wears on a Sunday morning when the church gathers. We would give them a church email address and a phone extension, even office space that they could use at the church. We would list them on staff lists wherever we were listing. So whether it was on a website or a church bulletin, and by the way, it's not with a little V in parentheses next to their name like they're a volunteer. We blur those lines. We want to list them as one of our staff. For many of them, we do performance reviews. We have them fill out vacation request forms because their role is so important that we're just saying, listen, if you're gone on vacation, we need to know there's people depending on you. We try to resource them and provide environments for them to succeed. So treat them like staff. Blur those lines between paid and unpaid. That was a very big learning for us. Another one is to give them authority. So, and I would even say it's important to transfer authority publicly to them in front of a team. So to stand before a team and say, hey, this is Kristen, and Kristen is your new leader. And I want you to treat Kristen just like you have treated me so well as your leader for these last number of times, but to transfer that authority publicly. Craig Rochelle talks often about delegating tasks or delegating authority versus tasks, because delegating tasks creates followers. Like if I tell you, go set up the chairs and set them up this way and go run the numbers and run them this way. Like if I'm telling someone to do something a particular way, go build this for me, you're creating people who will do what they're told. Those are followers. But if you take someone in and you say, listen, here's the challenge that we're facing. Here's the problem that we need to solve. Or can you help to figure out what the problem is? And so let's agree on the problem. And then say, how do you think we should address that problem? And let them pray about it. Let them decide on a solution. And then share your input with them, but give them the ability to make whatever change needs to be made. If you do that, you've delegated authority. And there may be mistakes, and they're going to grow. But it's a very important aspect. And I would just say, take the time to do that up front. Trust has to build over time, but some of that time spent at the front end, where you'll be thinking, man, this would be a lot faster if I just did it myself. That investment of time at the front end is going to pay off big time on the back end, because you're going to be freed to do this again. So we talked about the first 3 steps. I told you that there's a couple of other steps that I talk about in the book. Step 4 is just staying power, where we talk about retention. Normally we use money, businesses use money and raises and bonuses as the carrot to keep people engaged. Obviously, when you're working with volunteer leaders, you have to come up with other things. And so I would say that that's an important thing to think about, is retention. And then finally, step 5 is what we call equip, unleash, repeat. That is just communicating to our folks that everybody on our staff has 2 jobs. The one job is the job in your job description. The other job is finding your replacement. And so this is how the stream continues to kind of bubble over the rocks as it flows, because I'm doing a job now, but my replacement will come in and do a job because I'm raising them up right through this volunteer culture. So I'm going to wrap up, but if I could just leave you with one thought today. Like if you're sitting here thinking right now of all the reasons why this won't work in your church, I went through all of that too. The very first hurdle that you need to get over is to believe that this is possible. To believe that when you go and approach someone with a high capacity opportunity, that person is going to say yes. I was amazed that the first round we did this. We went to person after person after person after person and said, we've got this big job for you. We want you to come on to our staff. We're not going to pay you any money, but here's what it looks like. They all said yes the first time through. Believe that it's possible. Again, you can grab all the slides in this slide deck over at DerekSanford.com. You can do /unleash, and I think it'll take you there. And if you want to pause and reflect, reach out to me. Please feel free to do so. I'd love to be a resource to you. God bless you. Take care.